Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen. The running order for this conference is always a topic of discussion amongst current scholars, so you can imagine my relief when John Stones informed me that this year we'll be running in height order. Now down to business. Today's farming system is under massive pressure from public lobby groups, pressure groups, NGOs, call them what you will, with their insatiable appetite for public support on issues that often include animal welfare, the environment and wildlife. Their actions are crippling our industry under a massive burden of additional regulation resulting from their political influence. And you don't have to be a Nuffield doctor to see that we need to represent ourselves much more effectively in the face of this challenge. A trip to the Civil War battlefields in Gettysburg during the Contemporary Scholars Conference showed me that if we are to overcome our challenges, we need to adapt and innovate. But how do we adapt and innovate? That is the subject of my Nuffield topic and the subject of my presentation to you today. I've travelled to 3 countries with similar socio-economic drivers to ourselves and also facing similar challenges from pressure groups, namely Australia, New Zealand and the United States. I looked at how the farming industry in each country has responded to these challenges and found 3 examples of industry innovation. I learned valuable lessons from all 3 examples, with one model forming the basis of my recommendations to you today. In Australia, as well as plenty of beach volleyball, this tournament being held at Coonamble, some 450 kilometres from the sea, and home of Hugh Roberts, a Nuffield scholar, the urban-rural divide is widening. The Greens are in coalition with the ruling party, and pressure groups abound. Their response was based on a sector-specific activities, in many cases, with little evidence of cross-sector collaboration. I saw plenty of single-sector educational initiatives in evidence, and I met with the organisers of the 2012 Year of the Australian Farmer, who are planning some 30 projects to make this as effective as possible, and well worth looking at if you're on the internet. I was also kindly hosted by Deb Bain of Farm Day, their version of Open Farm Sunday, who some of you will be aware of, who was trying hard to build capacity. No mean feat, given the vast distances between Australian cities and farms. Despite meeting these and other inspiring farmers, I saw little difference between their approach and the UK approach to the challenges posed by pressure groups. As you can see from the picture, great tracts of southeast Australia, not least and Queensland, were flooded while I was there, highlighting the scale of environmental challenges faced by Australian farmers, not least Jim Gelch, who many of you all know, who lost 150 hectares of field tomatoes just prior to harvest on rented ground. Somehow it makes our dry summer seem small in comparison. And thus I headed for New Zealand with more questions than answers. My itinerary in New Zealand was set following an impromptu Skype call with New Zealand scholar James Parsons. Now, unfortunately for James, I'd just come out of the shower with a towel around my waist when he called. But it didn't really bother me, but to James, who could only see my top half, I was to all intents and purposes naked. Thankfully, the spirit of Nuffield prevailed. James overlooked my indiscretion and kindly pointed me in the direction of Sandra Taylor, an agricultural journalist in Christchurch. I contacted Sandra 10 days after the earthquake had hit Christchurch in February, smashing all the windows in her house and ripping some of the walls out. Still, she was enthusiastic I should come and stay. Not least because she is involved in an innovative industry-wide project called Farming for Our Future, which involves public relations work. Surrounded by devastation and aftershocks, we discussed her role in that project, and I travelled to meet other industry leaders and put that in context. Now, Farming for Our Future was born following a successful environmental campaign called Dirty Dairying by the Fish and Game New Zealand group. They are the New Zealand equivalent of Game Conservancy Trusts. And this catchphrase, Dirty Dairying, stuck firmly in public minds, and additional regulation had been imposed as a result, and the farming industry had collectively decided to set the record straight. At the time of my visit, they consisted of a steering group of 20 agriculturalists, including Sandra, and they were in the process of establishing an organisation to coordinate and manage public engagement work for the whole farm industry. Their aims were broadly to take a cross-sector approach to educational initiatives, as we do in this country already through FACE, and to coordinate and support the work of industry advocates. And by setting up a database of trained advocates and a set of defined messages, Farming for Our Future aimed to control what message is delivered by who, when, and how. And I believe this is something we can learn from and I'll refer to later. It's early days for Farming for Our Future, but the seeds of adaptation and innovation were germinating well. At last, I had a model on which to offer something positive to the UK industry as a result of my scholarship. But little did I know this was the tip of the iceberg. And at the conference in Edinburgh last year, I noticed a paragraph in the Farmer's Guardian on my seat reporting US Farmers and Ranchers Alliance to fund PR campaign. My eyes immediately lit up. Brilliant, I thought. A second example of industry-wide public relations work. I soon booked a flight and off to St. Louis, Missouri, to meet Hugh Whaley and the team at USFRA, the Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. On arrival, I was a little concerned to find that Missouri was suffering the worst flooding of a generation, and I began to question my luck. In a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, the extent of the flooding in Missouri had led to the US Army destroying a flood bank of the Mississippi, diverting it some 35 miles, and flooding over 200,000 acres of farmland in order to reduce the risk of flooding in one city. Kind of puts it in context. Was it just me, or did disastrous weather follow me everywhere? Hugh Whaley explained that the aims of the USFRA were broadly similar to the Farming for Our Future in New Zealand. They were just a year ahead, in that they had established an organisation that had recently raised over $20 million from industry partners. And at the time of my visit, they were selecting a PR agency to develop and deliver a 3-year strategy. The key lesson I learned from Hugh, though, was that if you want to get different sectors of agriculture around the table, sometimes you have to take certain topics out of the room. And in their case, those topics were biofuels and government policy, allowing the partners to focus on the job in hand. Another important recommendation that I'll refer to later. Great, I thought, that's it, recommendations in the bag. Cross-sector collaboration, take topics off the table if you have to, coordinate and manage public engagement work by coordinating and managing industry advocates. But in the immortal words of Jimmy Cricket, there's more. Still feeling guilty that I was at least partially responsible for the flooding of 200,000 acres of farmland, I emailed 2011 Australian Nuffield scholar Roma Britnell, who I met in Australia a couple of months previously. Roma had by that time done some travelling of her own, and in her reply she told me of a man called Charlie Arnott, who she had seen speaking in Canada on the subject of public trust in food. Thankfully, Charlie was based just 100 miles from Bart Ruth's house in Nebraska, where I sat that evening watching live weather updates as a tornado passed by. This was really worrying. Right, now if anyone's dozed off at this point, give them a nudge, because this next model explains what I recommend the industry and we should do and what I'm working on currently. Charlie Arnott happens to lead the Centre for Food Integrity. And the Centre for Food Integrity, based in the States, was established in 2007 with the prime focus of building consumer trust and confidence in the food system. It is a not-for-profit organisation sponsored by many businesses across the whole food chain, including farmers, universities, food manufacturers, food processors, retailers, and restaurant chains. This way of working is appropriate and necessary for us because agriculture is only a small, if vital, part of the food chain, and it is that chain that links farmers and the consumer. So, briefly on the Centre for Food Integrity, it does 3 things for its members. It corrects misinformation, and it shares accurate and balanced information. It highlights best ways of building consumer trust, and it provides a forum by which consumer concerns can be addressed by members, and consensus reached and strategies developed. And to achieve this, it takes a scientific approach. It designs and develops scientific models that define and communicate public trust. It researches and develops messages that build consumer trust. And it trains and develops highly qualified, respected people to deliver positive and accurate information to key influencer audiences. And interestingly or notably, it does not lobby or advocate on behalf of any individual food company or brand. As you can see, from what I've said, the Centre for Food Integrity turns public relations from a dark art into science, making it easier for sponsors to understand, value, and thus buy into. Suffice to say, I am absolutely convinced that this is the best way to deal with pressure groups in this country and increase the sales of British-produced food from supermarket shelves. I called Charlie Arnott last week, and he's closely working now with the Canadian and Australian food industries to assist their efforts in combating the negative effects of pressure groups. It's about time we engaged him and learned from his experience. As a result of this study, I've already spoken with many retailers, food manufacturers and processors. I found broad support for my proposals to establish an organisation that will lead, coordinate and manage a strategy to improve public trust in British food. My next move is to engage with agricultural organisations, and this is where your support comes in. This is not a one-man crusade. I have simply found an appropriate answer to a major issue that is crushing our industry, and I'm doing my best to put it into action. Many of you will also have noticed this week that the Oxford Farming Conference in January has dedicated a whole morning to the subject of public trust and food chain collaboration. As such, this topic is of its time, and we need to act now before our industry is stifled further by pressure groups and regulation. It simply remains, ladies and gentlemen, for me to thank the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust for awarding me the scholarship in the first place and for seeing the value of my study almost before I knew it, to be honest. My employer and colleagues at Natural England for their support and for covering my work while I travelled. Fellow Nuffield scholars, and notably Jeff Sansom and Louisa Rob Manning, for putting up with my ramblings and on occasion with semi-naked video calls. And last but by no means least, my wife Kate, my children Clara, who's here today, and Tim, and my wider family for their patience, love and devotion throughout. Thank you very much.